Good afternoon and welcome to September's Lunch and Learn lecture. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to join the stream. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Lunch and Learn presentation. We're just going to give folks a few more minutes to join the stream before we get started. One last welcome to everyone who's joined us so far for this afternoon's Lunch and Learn presentation. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Allie Smith, and I work in the Programs and Outreach Department of Enoch Pratt Free Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn, which Pratt hosts in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and Maryland 4 Centuries Project. Before we get things started, I would like to note that should you have any questions or comments for our presenter today, please enter them into the comment or chat box below the video, and we will address them all at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our partner with the Maryland State Archives. Please take it away, Owen.
Thank you, Allie, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Owen Lurie. I am the research coordinator, the outreach coordinator at the Maryland State Archives. These Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity to hear stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives in uncovering shared heritage. The Maryland State Archives holds records of permanent value to the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. If you are interested in exploring our records for your own research, I hope that you will come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. Our program today comes from Scott Shane and is entitled Flee North, A Forgotten Hero and the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland. It's one I'm very much looking forward to. I hope that you will join us next month for a presentation by my colleague here at the State Archives, Rachel Frazier, who will be telling us about some of the creepier, more Halloween-oriented items that we have here in the Archives holdings. You can find a full list of programs, including videos of past presentations, on our website, and you can always find many more programs from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. Now to introduce today's speaker, here's Bert Kummerow, founding director of the Maryland 4 Centuries Project.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome everyone to our monthly Lunch and Learn lecture series on the 24th anniversary of 9/11. I represent the Maryland 4 Centuries Project, and we are working closely with the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library to bring you the very best new research on Maryland history every month. We are getting close to the U.S. 250th anniversary next year. Our mission at the Maryland's 4 Centuries Project is to get serious state history into the mix for the 2026 commemorative programs. Our Maryland Mosaic Project has uncovered 150 historic Maryland firsts, both here and in the entire nation. We see Maryland through a lens of leadership on the national stage. These pieces of a Maryland mosaic are in every county and Baltimore City. They show that our state has had a big influence on American history. Each mosaic piece has a sponsor that can tell its own story during the 2026 anniversary. And you can find out much more about our Maryland Mosaic Project at www.marylandmosaic, that's one word, .org. Right now, you can go to the Pratt Library main branch in downtown Baltimore and see a very impressive Maryland Mosaic exhibit near the Special Collections Office in the African American Department. Thanks to Tracy Thompson and Evan Dennis for that effort. It's a very fine effort. It closes in October, and we hope that it will travel to other venues. Now, today's lecture describes little-known individuals who are included in our Maryland Mosaic. During a 2024 trip to Boston, we visited the sprawling Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's one of the oldest in the nation. As we searched for the graves of historic figures like Winslow Homer and Harriet Beecher Stowe, we discovered a manicured circular plot with a large stone obelisk at its center. On closer inspection, we realized we had stumbled on the grave of the Reverend Charles Torrey. Having recently certified a Maryland first around the origin of the name Underground Railroad, we recognized the Reverend Torrey as a partner of a man named Thomas Smallwood. We learned that Mr. Torrey had an impressive monument because some abolitionists, little known today, were getting wide attention in the North before the Civil War for their singular devotion to the cause. And who was Reverend Torrey? As a committed abolitionist, he printed anti-slavery tracts and went to Maryland to help escaped slaves flee north. He was linked as a partner in this dangerous endeavor with a freed slave and shoemaker named Thomas Smallwood. You will soon learn that the amazing Mr. Smallwood is the main character in today's lecture. Our speaker, Scott Shane, is ready to tell you a story about all but forgotten heroes who should have been in our history books all along. His best-selling book, Flee North, is evidence that Mr. Shane is not only a prize-winning journalist, but also an accomplished public historian. I'm so pleased that Scott Shane, a veteran reporter of 15 years at the New York Times and 21 years at the Baltimore Sun, has become a fellow Maryland historian. I'm eager to learn the details of this very important story. So please join me in welcoming Scott Shane.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Owen. I spent a lot of very valuable time doing research for this book at the Maryland State Archives. And I have spent untold hours at the Pratt over the many years, the 40 years I've lived in Baltimore. So thanks to those institutions, whenever you see a book of history, there's a whole lot of librarians and archivists who are standing behind it, usually unsung. And these are some of them. Before I start showing my slides, I have a bunch of slides, but I just want to get you in the mood by telling a story from this book that captures some of its elements. So let me do a little time travel. Let's go back to the summer of 1842, and we're in Southeast Washington, D.C. We're in the home of a physician and slaveholder by the name of William Gunnell. And this guy Gunnell has he has enslaved a number of people, and one is a 5-year-old girl. And he has the 5-year-old girl working full-time all night long. He has a new baby. He and his wife have a new baby. And this little 5-year-old is assigned to sit by the baby's cradle in the parents' bedroom all night long, every night. And if the baby stirs, the 5-year-old enslaved girl is supposed to rock the cradle so that the baby doesn't disturb the parents. And perhaps because of the sort of extreme nature of putting a 5-year-old to work on a 7 nights a week job, perhaps because of fear that this child might be sold south away from her, or that she might be sold south away from this child, the little girl's mother has decided she's had enough of slavery and she's ready to try to make a run for it. And she's heard about some people who are helping organize mass escapes in the Washington and Baltimore area. And so she is part of a group of 15 people, men, women, and children, who are going to meet in a particular spot, a designated spot in DC in the middle of the night after midnight, and try to make their getaway. But as you can imagine, the biggest challenge, it's a huge challenge just to get across town after the 10 p.m. curfew for African Americans and get away. But she has a bigger challenge because she has to sneak into the bedroom of her enslavers who are asleep. This is probably 1, 2, 3 in the morning. And she has to somehow spirit her 5-year-old daughter out of there without waking the baby and without waking the parents. And through a stroke of good luck, she manages to do this. She gets across town. and they join this group that are trying to escape, but they are told by the people who are helping them, Thomas Smallwood and Charles Torrey, that they have not managed to get a wagon and team of horses, and they'll have to hide all of them, all 15 people, for 24 hours while they try and get the equipment together. You can imagine this is not a matter of texting everybody to set up an escape like this. So it's understandable that things don't always work smoothly, but they managed to find a hiding place in cellars, in sheds, in attics for 24 hours with friendly assistants, helpers, and everyone's hidden away for another 24 hours. And the next morning, next night, they have the team of horses in the wagon, and they take off. But in the meantime, you can imagine that with 15 enslaved people disappearing from multiple households in DC the same morning, word has spread. People are talking about, what's happened, and they have hired a posse of slave catchers to go north and look for the people who've escaped. And so those people have taken off on the day when, according to the schedule, these folks might have gotten away, but of course they haven't gotten away. They're in hiding. So the second night, the wagon takes off and they get somewhere north of DC before they reach Baltimore, and the hiding place for the next night. And the axle on the wagon goes out, and they steer off the wagon to a clump of trees and start trying to figure out how to fix it. And right at that moment, they see this party of well-armed slave catchers coming south together on the same road. So if they hadn't broken the axle, it's very possible that the game would be up. They all would have been captured. And as it was, they watched these guys pass and leave on their way south, not having had any success in finding any of the people who'd escaped. They fix the wagon, they head on their way, and a couple days later, word gets to Thomas Smallwood, who in this case is staying in DC, that they are in Troy, New York, and getting aboard canal boats for Canada. So it was one of many successful escapes organized by these guys. So with that little story, let me go ahead and start showing these slides. Allie, we ready to go? Yes. All right. So
yes, we are, Scott. Sorry about that. Can you just maximize your presenter view with your slides? If you just maximize the screen, we should be able to see them a little better.
Maximize. Okay. Let's see. Use slideshow, maybe. Let's see.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Sorry about that. Okay. So the book is called Flee North. And it is about Thomas Smallwood, who is the forgotten hero of the subtitle. What I like to do in these talks is I introduce you to the three main characters of this book. I introduce you to the setting, to the big themes, but I kind of try to avoid the plot and spoilers in case folks want to read it. So that's what I'll do today. And I sometimes begin with Smallwood, but this time I'm going to actually get first into the bad guy of the story, because the two things I wanted that I think are sort of missing from the sort of most Americans' understanding of that period. One is the domestic slave trade, which we'll get into in a second. And the other is this character, Thomas Smallwood, who actually helped liberate several times more people than the terrific and the courageous and much more famous Harriet Tubman, and was operating about 10 years earlier. and also authored the only, as far as I can tell, the only real-time accounts of escapes from slavery written by an organizer of those escapes and published in real time. So this guy really deserves to be in the pantheon of American heroes, and this book is a first step towards that goal. So let's start with a little bit of background. There we go. I hit two at once. So slavery's borderland. I use that term in the subtitle, and by that I only mean the line between the slave states and the free states. This is in the 1840s when this story takes place. This is a period map that shows that, and of course, we are very near the Mason-Dixon line, very near that boundary. And that made this a very, very interesting time in the antebellum period. If you went to Boston, you could find plenty of abolitionists, but you wouldn't find a slave trader. If you went to New Orleans, you would find lots of slave traders and no abolitionists. But in Baltimore and Washington, the northernmost cities of the slave South, you found some representation from everybody with every view on slavery. And that led to a lot of conflict and a lot of tumult at times. At that time, in the 1840 census, just short of 500,000 people living in Maryland, of whom about 90,000 were enslaved African Americans. But the free Black population was over 60,000. So a very substantial free Black population. And in the cities, Baltimore was the big city of that time in this region. And not only in this region, Baltimore was actually the second largest city in the United States after New York in 1840, and was over 100,000 people in population. But you'll see that those proportions of enslaved African Americans and free African Americans is reversed. While there were more enslaved people than free people in the state, in the cities, the ratio was reversed, and there were 18,000 free Black people in Baltimore, only 3,000 something enslaved. In Washington, which at the time was sort of a village plus the federal government, much, much smaller, there were about 5,000 free Blacks and only about 1,700 enslaved Black people. So these folks, the enslaved and the free, were often in the same families. They were going to the same churches. They were very mixed up together. So that also made this area an extremely interesting place during that period, as this story, I think, illustrates. So before I get into the Underground Railroad, I'm going to talk about the domestic slave trade, because very, very few Americans really understand the scale and nature of the domestic slave trade. So briefly, the African slave trade was banned by Congress as of 1808. It was no longer legal to import kidnapped Africans to work on American farms and plantations. And at that period, in the early 19th century, tobacco was wearing out the soil of the Chesapeake, the Upper South, and many farmers were switching and planters were switching from tobacco to grains and other crops that were much less labor intensive. So partly because of that, there was a surplus of enslaved labor in the Upper South. And that coincided with the invention of the cotton gin and a huge boom in production and demand for cotton in the Deep South. So that the planters of the Deep South, both in cotton and sugar, had pretty much an unlimited demand for workers, and they could no longer import them from Africa. So not surprisingly, in this capitalist country, a class of traders arose, domestic slave traders, who would buy unwanted workers in this region, the Chesapeake region, and either march them down on foot to the Gulf Coast, or bring them. The guy we'll learn about in just a second would ship them by sea, down the East Coast, around Florida, into New Orleans, where they would be sold for higher prices into the sugar and cotton plantations. And that was a very lucrative trade. And between about 1810 and the Civil War, roughly 1 million people were forced south. So this was a huge forced migration. And the tragedy of it was that it almost always divided families. Wives were separated from husbands, parents from children, and that was just a routine thing that was happening all the time here. And this guy, Hope Slatter, is the bad guy of this book, and he was a very bad guy. He was the dominant slave trader in the Chesapeake region from the late 1830s to the late 1840s. And he operated out of Baltimore's Inner Harbor. And because the feds wanted to make sure that shiploads of African Americans or Africans showing up in New Orleans were not coming from Africa against the law, in violation of the law, but had left a U.S. port, Slatter had to fill out one of these manifests for every shipment. And they are very useful records. And actually, because it uses the full names of everybody he's shipping south, and with other age and other details, they are very useful for African American genealogy in many cases. But this guy operated from Pratt Street, just a couple blocks from the Inner Harbor. He ran an ad in the Baltimore Sun every day, headed "Cash for Negroes." This one is from the late 1830s, when he had just built his private slave jail on Pratt Street, just east of Howard. And he's bragging about the male and female apartments are completely separate. The rooms for both are large, light, and airy, and all above ground. Fine, large yard for exercise. And he brags about the quality of the water. He makes it sound almost like a hotel. But of course, the bottom line is a little below there. It says cash and the highest prices will be at all times paid for likely slaves of both sexes. And that was his business. He advertised not only in Baltimore, but in cities on the Eastern Shore in Southern Maryland. And he would send his boys out to buy from slaveholders who needed cash or who no longer wanted a worker. And they would be brought to Baltimore and held there until there was a ship leaving for New Orleans. Believe it or not, the Maryland Center for History and Culture has one photographer's work from the mid-1840s. So this is what the harbor looked like in those days. And this is what Baltimore Street looked like in those days, for just a little atmosphere. And this was Hope Slatter's slave jail. It was photographed in 1910, of course, long after it was no longer used as a slave jail. It seems to have been used as for storage, but that's the courtyard. And you can tell that it was a very substantial building with bars on the windows. And that is where he stored men and women and children until he had a shipload to send south. As I mentioned, the tragedy of this is the separation of families. This is from an anti-slavery book, and it portrays one of these sales. It's clear that the tall man in the middle holding his hat with his arm in the air is being sold south. He's saying goodbye to his wife, who's holding their baby. Presumably those are their children around. The slaveholder seems to be that woman in the bonnet, the white woman in the bonnet in the back, and the sleazy looking guy in the top hat and the striped pants is the slave trader. We've forgotten the domestic slave trade, but at the time it was extremely well known, was a very important part of the abolitionist attacks on the institution of slavery. And this is the same thing in the nation's capital, where a lot of this story unfolds. And this is, again, an anti-slavery propaganda poster, basically, but it quite accurately portrays what was going on. There's the ship waiting to haul these people off, and the flag and the U.S. Capitol are up in the corner, which was a point made by many abolitionists that this slave trade took place in the capital of a country that claimed to be a land of freedom. You could not walk from the White House to the Capitol in those days, to Congress, without passing the premises of Washington's largest slave trader. So that's very much the backdrop to this story, and the backdrop to the first decades of Thomas Smallwood. And so let's move right on to him. So Smallwood, I would show you a picture of him, but I haven't found one. He lived into the photography era, and it may be that there's one hiding somewhere or that there's a sketch somewhere, but I have not been able to lay my hands on it. So I use in its place his signature. But that's very appropriate because this is a guy who not only learned to read and write, but became quite a brilliant and, I would say, unique writer, as we'll learn. So the fact that a man born in slavery in 1801, had a signature that he could sign was already unusual. He was born in Bladensburg, which, as you know, is just northeast of DC, on what's now the Anacostia River. And, like the lives of most people growing up in slavery, his life is a bit of a blank. It was, I have not been able to identify his parents. I don't know much about his childhood. I do know that he was inherited along with his sister by a woman who made a second marriage to a fellow named John Ferguson. And John Ferguson was a minister, but he seemed to make his living mostly at a lumber yard. And he lived in Bladensburg initially, and then he and his wife moved to Southeast DC. He told Thomas, before we get to that, let me just make one other point. In Bladensburg, it turns out one thing of sort of international note has happened in the history of Bladensburg, and that was the Battle of Bladensburg. Some of you may know that was part of the War of 1812. This was in 1814. You may recall that the British forces, blew into Washington and burned the White House and the Capitol. Well, they blew into Washington through Bladensburg, and apparently the Americans did not put up much of a fight, so they weren't in Bladensburg for long. However, something I did not know before I researched this book was that fighting with the British forces was a group called the Corps of Marines, and the Corps of Marines were recruited among formerly enslaved men. And so there were black men, there was a unit of black men fighting with the British forces in 1814 when they came through Bladensburg. Smallwood never mentioned this, so I am speculating, but it's hard to imagine that a 13-year-old in Bladensburg, where nothing has ever happened, doesn't notice, this battle taking place. And he may well have seen or heard of these black soldiers who were fighting for the Brits and who had received their freedom in return for fighting for the British. And also at the same time, according to the British officers' reports, there were camp followers, African-American camp followers, who had walked off the places where they were enslaved, including some women and children, and who just kind of followed the British forces around on the idea that these guys might give me my freedom. So I can only imagine the cross currents in the mind of young Thomas Smallwood. On the one hand, he's American, and this is the enemy. On the other hand, these are guys who look like him, were formerly enslaved like he was. And so you can only imagine what emotions that might call up in a teenager. Anyway, when he was 15, John Ferguson, his enslaver, filed this paper with the Prince George's County Courthouse in Upper Marlboro, and he promised to free Thomas when he turned 30 in 15 years. And he told Thomas separately that he was paying $500 to his wife, his new wife, and her children from a previous marriage, because they were the people who had inherited Thomas, and that he wanted Thomas to pay him back the $500 over time. So Thomas would sometimes be hired out, and he would save part of his salary, and he paid off his those $500. Now you ask, why would Ferguson bother to go to the courthouse when Thomas is 15 years before he's going to free him? Why not just wait till he's 30? But part of it is we're talking about the 19th century, and Ferguson may not be living when this time comes. And there are many instances in that period where a widow has second thoughts about whatever her late husband's intentions might have been. So this kind of puts it on the record, makes it official, and ensures Thomas that he will be freed in 15 years. Something else I should say is that John Ferguson, who was hostile to slavery, not an out-and-out abolitionist, which was sort of a radical in those days, but hostile to the institution of slavery, he and his wife taught Thomas to read, which was highly unusual. And subsequently, Thomas was hired out as a household servant in the name of a prominent DC educator named John McLeod. And Smallwood says that McLeod and his adult children loaned him a lot of books, encouraged him in his learning. And the result was that this was a guy who had a voracious appetite for reading, for learning of all kinds. And by the time he was free at the age of 30, he had never set foot in a schoolhouse. He had not even gone to kindergarten. So he had absolutely no formal education. But I would venture to say that he was probably as well educated as if he'd been to university and graduate school, as you will see. He gets his freedom at the age of 30. He marries a free woman from Virginia by the name of Elizabeth Anderson, and they set up house in Southeast Washington in the neighborhood just north, a couple blocks north of the Navy Yard. So in this picture of DC, you can see the Capitol up on Capitol Hill. You can see the White House, then known as the President's House, off to the left. And those big white buildings down on the river, on the Anacostia River, are the Navy Yard, which is still there. And Smallwood started a business as a shoemaker. And sometimes he apparently had a good reputation and quite a reputation. And some contemporary documents refer to him as Smallwood of the Yard, meaning the Navy Yard neighborhood. He, as a young guy who has gotten himself educated and really taken an interest in the world and is, for obvious reasons, very preoccupied with the issue of slavery and the future of slavery, he took a big interest in the colonization movement, which, as you may know, was a movement organized by the American Colonization Society to shift, to move free African Americans off of U.S. soil to other places. The large one, sorry, did I just, there we go. To move them to other places, notably the new Republic of Liberia, which the American Colonization Society had founded in West Africa. So this is a contemporary picture of Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, named for President James Monroe. Which, Liberia is still there, Monrovia is still there. And Smallwood was very interested in this. He had two friends who moved to Liberia. But at some point, probably around 1829, 1830, about the time he was gaining his freedom, he describes a real kind of revolution in his thinking. And that was quite common at the time. As he put it later on, I was grievously deceived. The object and policy of that society proved to be, under the mask of philanthropy, the draining off the free-colored population from among the slave population by inducing them to emigrate to Africa. For the doctrine of its leaders was that the free population contaminated the slave population with a spirit of freedom, which made them uneasy in their bonds. So what he realized was this was not really a society that whose mission was to help Black people get a new start in Africa. Their real goal was to drain free Blacks out of the U.S. because they thought the presence of a free Black population, made it difficult to hold people in bondage. So he broke with that movement. And, by the time he's 40, he's married. He has some kids. He has 4 kids and a 5th on the way. He and his wife has a laundry business. They're doing quite well. He has abandoned this colonization movement and denounces it at every turn. but he is still very focused on slavery, wants to do something about it. And that's when this guy arrives. And I guess if Smallwood was a pool of gasoline, this guy's the match. Very, very different background. Torrey was a significantly younger white guy. So Thomas Smallwood was about 40, and Torrey's 28 when he comes to DC. Torrey has gotten the best education, formal education you could get. He's been to Exeter and Yale, and he has studied for the ministry. He tried out as a school teacher after Yale for about a year. It was a disaster, and he pretty much fled the field of education and decided to try his hand at ministry. He did get preaching jobs in 2 different churches, but he didn't thrive in that job. I found someone who said that Charles Torrey gave a terrible sermon. And so by the time he was pretty much invited to leave the second church, he'd gotten very caught up in the anti-slavery movement, which at that time was in the 1830s was just ferociously spreading around New England. Every little town in New England, upstate New York, had an anti-slavery society. And Smallwood got involved in Massachusetts, and he was one of the people who was challenging William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist you may have heard of, for kind of the leadership and the direction of the anti-slavery movement in New England. And this is just to give you a sample of how hot those arguments were about the tactics and the direction of the anti-slavery movement. This is a letter Torrey wrote to an older man, his mentor, Amos Phelps, who was one of his allies against Garrison. So Garrison, as you may know, had a famous abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And here Torrey says, "I know how hard it is to my own spirit to keep still and be the object of attack in the lying berater from week to week without the power to reply." So he is talking about these internal fights, which were really bitter. They tried to topple Garrison. They failed. These guys started their own rival publication, Rival Anti-Slavery Society. But about this time, Torrey, who had married, had 2 kids. He had married the daughter of one of his teachers and mentors as a minister, as a preacher. And so it was a somewhat awkward situation. But he needed to come up with a new way to make money. And so he decided to try a third profession after teaching and preaching, and something that I did for 40 years, and that was journalism. So he goes around to a bunch of small abolitionist papers in the North, in New England and New York, and says, "I will be your Washington correspondent." Enough take him up on it that he thinks he has a going enterprise, and he decides he's going to move to DC. So at the end of 1841, December of 1841, he says goodbye to his wife and kids who are living with her parents in Massachusetts and heads to DC. And part of this is to see slavery with his own eyes. DC, of course, is a place where slavery is legal and the slave trade is quite obvious. And so is Baltimore. And so he heads down there, he gets there, and he spots something he thinks will make a great story. And that is a convention of slaveholders in January of 1842 that's taking place in Annapolis. It's the first big gathering of Maryland slaveholders to talk about the problems that they're running into. So he thinks it'll be great to go there and be a fly on the wall and write this up for his newspapers. And that's what he does. But what happens is the first thing they do is they throw out the reporters who have gathered there. And Torrey, instead of leaving, sneaks up to the balcony and thinks he's going to hide out on the balcony and eavesdrop. But someone spots him up there, and they drag him down and throw him out of the building. And he finds himself on the streets of Annapolis surrounded by an anti-abolitionist mob. Maryland was not always a hospitable place, or was rarely a hospitable place in those days for abolitionists. So this mob is basically deciding whether to lynch him or just tar and feather him when a magistrate comes along and asks what's going on and jails Torrey pretty much for his own protection in the Annapolis jail. In that jail, he spends a couple days. They can't find anything to charge him with, and so they let him out. So he doesn't really get to attend much of the slaveholders convention, but he meets two black families who are in the Annapolis jail. They're jailed because they are property in an estate dispute. And depending how the court rules, they may well all be sold south. If they're sold south, they're very likely to be separated from each other. And so he learns, I don't know how much he knew about this before, but he learns about this, firsthand from these people. He's very moved by it. And as a very passionate young man, he writes for one of his newspapers, what he calls the vow in the Annapolis jail, where he says, "I will not cease to talk, write, preach, pray, and vote against slavery till there is no slaveholder in any church or any slave in our land." So it's a great sentiment. It's a great stand, but he's basically at that time a 28-year-old nobody. So it's not clear how he's going to make this happen. So Thomas Smallwood, in his daily perusal of the local papers, sees the stories about this. This is written up locally, this whole furor over this abolitionist who's come from Massachusetts and gets locked up in Annapolis. It's all written up. And he's intrigued by this young white man, crazy young white man who's come and tried to confront the slaveholders or, eavesdrop on them and has gotten locked up. So he's also heard of this guy, it turns out, because his wife does the laundry for Mrs. Paget's boarding house. In those days, all the transients, including the members of Congress, stayed at the boarding houses. And at Mrs. Paget's boarding house, Torrey is staying, and he's met Elizabeth Smallwood, who does the laundry there. So Thomas Smallwood asks his wife if she can arrange a meeting, and she introduces the two, and they sit down together. Now, there's neither one left any account of that meeting, but it's interesting to think about these guys meeting over a real chasm of race, of course, quite a difference in age, a dozen years apart in age, huge difference in formal education. But I would say they were probably, I would suspect that if we could test them at that time, that Smallwood might have outclassed Torrey in terms of his learning, because he had just read everything. But they also had something in common, which was they had both spent a long time talking about the problem of slavery and not doing anything about it. And they wanted to do something. So they come up with an audacious scheme, and that is to start organizing escapes. And they don't want to do it in ones and twos. They decide to do it wholesale by the wagon load. And that's what they start doing. They start loading 10, 15, even 20 men, women, and children into a wagon at night, throwing a tarp over them, and taking off for Pennsylvania. They would make it the first night to a hideout near Baltimore, to the second night to a hiding place near the Susquehanna River, and the third night they would cross the Susquehanna on a secret ferry, a ferry boat run by an ally, and get into Pennsylvania. And they get into Pennsylvania, meet up with some Quakers, and the Quakers would conduct the people to Philly. And from Philly on, they would be pretty much, if they had the money for public transportation, they would be taking trains and steamboats. And Smallwood and Torrey were raising money for those tickets. And Smallwood always told people to keep going until he got to Canada, because he did not think they would be safe on U.S. soil. So right away in the summer of 1842, when they get going, there are ads, runaway ads, offering rewards that I know were people who Smallwood had helped to disappear. And so now I want to move on to what accompanied this, which was Smallwood's writing career. So one of the papers that Charles Torrey was writing for was this little paper in Albany, New York, called Tocsin of Liberty. Tocsin is an old word that means alarm bell, Liberty Bell, basically. And so Torrey had written for this paper, and Smallwood decided to try his hand at a column, and he started writing dispatches for this paper, which are really quite extraordinary. He would write about the slaveholders by their real names. He would write about the people escaping from them by their real names. He would celebrate the people escaping. He would mercilessly mock the slaveholders and the people who worked with them, the slave catchers, the slave catching police officers. And he wrote very much in the style of Charles Dickens, one of his favorite writers. And he actually borrowed the pseudonym, his pseudonym for these columns, because he obviously couldn't use his own real name. He called himself Samuel Weller. And that was the most famous character and the favorite character of readers in Dickens' best-selling novel of the time, The Pickwick Papers. So Smallwood started writing these pieces, and he began by kind of riffing on the runaway ads. He would quote the runaway ads like the ones I just showed you, and mock the slaveholders who are looking for their escaped property long after their escaped property is out of reach. And you see here he's citing the Latin poet Ovid. He is unleashing quite a wit. A whole column of notices of walking property walked off. And so he would kind of just riff on these things. I mentioned the 5-year-old child who is rocking the baby's cradle, who he helped to escape with her parents. And he addresses, Gunnell, the slaveholder, on reflection. Don't you think it was cruel, Dr. Gunnell, to make that little child only 5 years old lie on your chamber floor and keep awake to tend your own white baby while you and your wife slept? So I should say that Smallwood asked the editors in Albany to send a copy of every paper that mentioned a slaveholder to that slaveholder. So William Gunnell got a copy of the Albany paper and was able to read this stuff for himself. Of course, had no idea who was writing it. I'll just run quickly through these because I want to leave some time for questions. But this is one where he addresses, I said, he uses real names. He also uses this guy's address, George Gardner of Charles County, Maryland, who has advertised for an escaped slave named who he calls Henry, who calls himself Henry Edelin. Well, the reason they used that formula was that the slaveholders at the time had this convention that the enslaved didn't actually have last names. They didn't deserve last names, and they were a different class of human beings. But generally speaking, the enslaved did have last names, which they used. And maybe they would use them after they escaped. So he wanted to put it in the ad, but he didn't want to credit it as a fully fledged, official name. So this is a very common formula in those ads. Henry, who calls himself Henry Edelin. This sets off Smallwood, and Smallwood says here, "Pray, what should he call himself, Mr. Gardner? It may be that your phrase is only a part of that despicable system by which slaveholders are led to deny to their victims a family name, as if their family relations were not to be acknowledged even in words." So he's really giving the slaveholders a hard time. He exposes their crimes, crimes of rape and brutality, and just really is unrelenting in his attacks on the slaveholders and slave catchers. And here in this place, someone has speculated that maybe Torrey is the guy writing these Sam Weller letters. And Smallwood affects to be deeply offended, says, "How dare you mix me up with an obscure abolitionist like Charles Torrey?" And he says, "I, Samuel Weller Jr., will continue to scoff at, annoy, and expose the slaveholders and their crooked ways to their great mystification and great pain during weeks and months to come. The poor ignoramuses, to think to catch such a weasel as I asleep. And the final thing I want to say, I'll just say very briefly, that I discovered after I dug these copies of the Tocsin of Liberty, a pretty obscure paper, out of the Boston Public Library, out of a warehouse of the Boston Public Library, and read them all, read all these columns, I realized eventually I was able to show that it was Thomas Smallwood who introduced the term Underground Railroad into the language. He began to riff on this as a way of mocking the slaveholders. He would say, oh yeah, we're all getting away on an underground railroad, which at the time, of course, did not exist. There were railroads, but there were no underground railroads. And here he calls himself general agent of all the branches of the National Underground Railroad Steam Packet, Canal, and Footed Company, basically celebrating his role in helping escapes. So the final point I want to make very quickly is that these two phenomena, the domestic slave trade and the Underground Railroad, I gradually realized are intimately, deeply connected, because it was a dangerous thing to flee north. It was extremely dangerous, and it took a lot of courage. It sometimes took some help to make that decision. And what prompted people to run was frequently the fear that they were about to be sold south. In the 1850s, a guy went and interviewed a bunch of people who had escaped slavery and were living in Canada. And here are two of them, two of many who made the same point. The fear of being sold south had more influence in inducing me to leave than any other thing. Master used to say if we didn't suit him, he would put us in his pocket quick, meaning he would sell us. He would turn us into cash. And this other guy, George Ross, I came away because I was standing in fear of being separated from my wife and children. And Smallwood remarks in his short memoir published in 1851, he remarks on the same thing. I frequently had lots of slaves concealed about in Washington who had fled to me for safety when they got wind that their masters were about to sell them to the slave traders. So the last thing that I will say is that I asked the publisher if we could put a map in the front as the frontispiece of this book that has both these routes that represent alternate fates for the enslaved in the Chesapeake region on the same map. So this is the route that Hope Slatter's ships went south around Florida to New Orleans. And then there's the escape route up through Pennsylvania, usually through Philly, through New York, through Albany, and into Canada. And the last thing I'll leave you with is imagine the existential predicament of anyone enslaved in this region at a time. They know that they can be sold south away from their family at any time with no notice. They have to live with that knowledge. But they also know that they're not that far from Pennsylvania. And they certainly would know people, possibly family members, who had been sold south and never heard from again. And they might well know of people who, at least the grapevine said, had made it to the free state of Pennsylvania and onward to the north. So with that, I will stop talking, and perhaps we have time for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was wonderful. I learned a ton, and I'm excited to pick up my hold on your book at the library this afternoon. So thanks again. We do have just a couple questions.
Yes.
John from Facebook asks a technical one. So you say that the slave traders were forging documents to make it look like slaves were arriving to Louisiana from the east coast of the U.S. instead of Africa. Was there any effort to discourage this illegal activity, or was everything taken tongue in cheek?
No, I may not have made that clear. So what was banned was the African trade. After 1808, it was illegal to import anyone from any of these captive, kidnapped people from Africa. So the domestic trade was completely legal. It was completely legal and a federally regulated trade that allowed Hope Slatter to accumulate people at the Baltimore harbor, put them aboard a ship, take them to New Orleans, and sell them for a higher price. So, what is remarkable when you look back on it is, of these two phenomena, the domestic slave trade and Underground Railroad. One was completely legal and operated in the open. Hope Slatter had a sign out on Pratt Street near the Inner Harbor. Everyone knew what he was doing. He was doing it out in the open. Totally legal. And though certainly a moral crime. And on the other hand, the Underground Railroad was completely illegal. It was illegal under Maryland law to assist or entice, as they said, anyone in fleeing from slavery. And there were people who were prosecuted for that. Not only were the folks who tried to escape and were recaptured often punished, often by being sold south, anyone who helped them could be imprisoned for doing that. So today we see that as certainly slavery as the crime and the Underground Railroad as the kind of moral heroes. But in the 1840s, it was entirely reversed.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. And then one more question from our friends at the Maryland State Archives, more general this time. Is there any favorite anecdote or story that didn't make it into the book that you'd like to share?
In the book. Well, let me think. I mean, I'll make a point that try not to include a spoiler in this, but as you can imagine, Thomas Smallwood, who was organizing these mass escapes, writing about the mass escapes for a public newspaper, and then to rub the slaveholders' face in this, mailing the newspaper to the slaveholders, he got a lot of attention. There were big rewards offered in both Baltimore and Washington for the uncovering who was behind these escapes. So you might ask, how did he last as long as he lasted? I'm not going to say exactly how long he lasted, but I estimate that he probably freed between 200 and 400 people while he was operating. And, it did not last forever. But what I'll say is it only dawned on me after the book was written that the reason he was able to last was, and in some ways his greatest disguise, were his writings. Because no police officer who's looking to, or slave catcher who's looking to foil these escapes and figure out who's writing these letters is going to think that they were written by a formerly enslaved black shoemaker, because they're extremely erudite, they're extremely well written. So it may be that he was able to operate as long as he was able because of those writings. They may have ultimately raised a flag, over his head, but for a long time, it may have thrown the police off the scent.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. And I have our thank yous to everyone. Huge thanks again to you, Scott, for your storytelling in this presentation. Thank you to our partners at the Maryland State Archives and the Maryland's 4th Century Project. Thank you to Gateway Interpreting for providing accessibility for today's program. And thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon. I have put a survey link into the comment box as well if you are interested in filling that out after the program. And I hope you take care and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.